When you think of medieval kings meeting their end, you probably picture glorious deaths on battlefields, where steel rings against steel beneath banners snapping in autumn winds, or perhaps assassination by sword in throne rooms draped with tapestries and lit by flickering torches. But there was another king whose fate was so undignified and shocking that it challenged every notion of royal dignity and transformed political murder into something that seemed more suited to the darkest folklore than recorded history. In the bitter cold of a November night in the year 1016, a 25-year-old monarch, known to history as Edmund Ironside, sat down in a wooden privy to relieve himself, completely unaware that beneath him, in the reeking cesspit, waited an assassin with a blade whose upward thrust would create one of the most bizarre and disturbing murder stories in the annals of royal history. The England of 1016 was a realm convulsing with violence, where Danish armies had carved through the countryside like a scythe through wheat, and where the very survival of English kingship hung by the thinnest of threads. This was not the England of later romantic imagination, with its knights in shining armor and chivalrous codes, but a brutal landscape where political authority meant nothing without the sword to enforce it. The winter air carried the acrid smoke of burning villages and the desperate cries of the displaced, while in halls that had once echoed with Saxon poetry, Danish jarls now planned the methodical division of conquered lands with the cold efficiency of butchers carving a carcass. Into this chaos, Edmund had inherited a crown that was more burden than blessing. The young king, who would earn the epithet Ironside through his desperate valor, had spent the 7 months of his reign in almost constant warfare, leading exhausted armies across muddy fields and through forests where death waited behind every gnarled oak, all in a futile attempt to preserve what remained of his father's crumbling kingdom against enemies who seemed to multiply like ravens gathering on a battlefield. Yet, even as Edmund struggled against overwhelming odds, there were whispers in the shadows of his court, rumors of a conspiracy so vile that it would make even hardened warriors recoil in disgust. The plot taking shape involved not just political assassination, but a method so degrading that it seemed designed not merely to kill a king, but to destroy the very concept of royal dignity forever. The conspiracy that would ultimately claim Edmund's life had been born in the twisted mind of Edric Striona, a man whose very name had become synonymous with betrayal. Edric, whose nickname Striona meant the acquisitive, had risen from relatively humble origins to become one of the most powerful men in England through ruthless ambition and a willingness to betray anyone who stood between him and greater power. The England that Edmund Ironside inherited in April of 1016 was already shattered by decades of Danish raids and internal divisions. His father, Ethelred the Unready, had earned his unfortunate epithet through a consistent inability to read the political currents of his time, making decisions that appeared reasonable but inevitably led to greater disasters. The ealdormen, who should have been the backbone of royal authority, had instead become independent power brokers who viewed the crown as a useful tool for advancing their own interests, switching their allegiance between Saxon and Danish masters with cynical calculation. Born around 990 into this world of declining certainties, Edmund had witnessed from his earliest years the gradual collapse of everything his ancestors had built. The young prince had grown up in a court where whispers of treason were as common as prayers for deliverance, and where the only constant seemed to be the steady erosion of Saxon power that left the kingdom increasingly vulnerable to external threats. The formative experiences of Edmund's youth were shaped by the humiliating spectacle of his father's reign, particularly the payment of Danegeld that had transformed emergency measures into regular tribute, acknowledging Danish superiority. Year after year, the royal treasury had been emptied to purchase peace that lasted only until the next raiding season brought fresh demands, creating a vicious cycle that taught ambitious ealdormen to view their king not as a warrior leader, but as a weak negotiator whose primary function was to find money to pay off enemies. Among these unfaithful defenders, none was more notorious than Edric Striona, whose career serves as a perfect illustration of how traditional bonds of loyalty had broken down under constant crisis. Rather than serving as a faithful guardian of royal interests, Edric had transformed his position into a platform for personal enrichment, accumulating vast wealth through confiscation of church lands while maintaining the elaborate pretense of loyalty to whatever authority seemed most likely to advance his interests. The marriage of Edric to King Ethelred's daughter Eadgyth in 1009 had been arranged as a political alliance intended to ensure his loyalty through the strongest possible bonds of kinship. Instead, this marriage merely provided Edric with additional legitimacy for his treacherous activities, while giving him intimate access to royal plans that he could then sell to the highest bidder. This marriage also made Edric the brother-in-law of Edmund himself, creating a family connection that should have ensured absolute loyalty, but which, instead, became another weapon in his arsenal. The invasion of 1013 that drove King Ethelred into humiliating exile in Normandy had been the culmination of Saxon decline and institutional collapse. When Sweyn Forkbeard's armies swept across England like a destroying flood, they encountered little organized resistance because the institutions that should have coordinated such resistance had already been fatally weakened by years of internal division. The renewed Danish invasion that began in 1015 under Knut's leadership represented a qualitatively different threat, because Knut possessed not only superior military resources, but also a sophisticated understanding of English politics that allowed him to exploit the divisions that had paralyzed Saxon resistance. Rather than simply raiding for treasure as his predecessors had done, Knut was pursuing permanent political control, and he had the patience and strategic vision necessary to achieve such an ambitious goal. The murders of Sigurfurth and Morcar in 1015, orchestrated by Edric at King Ethelred's court in Oxford, perfectly illustrated how the climate of suspicion had made effective resistance impossible. These two powerful thanes controlled significant territories in the East Midlands and could have provided crucial support for royal resistance to Danish invasion. Instead of being welcomed as valuable allies, they were eliminated by royal agents who viewed them as potential threats rather than necessary partners. Edmund's decision to defy his father by marrying Sigurfurth's widow Ealdgyth and claiming control of the murdered Deag's territories demonstrated both his political intelligence and his willingness to break with the failed policies that had characterized his father's reign. This marriage brought Edmund into direct conflict with Edric, who had organized the murders and now found himself in the awkward position of being related by marriage to a young prince who had deliberately thwarted his plans. The personal animosity that developed between Edmund and Edric would prove to be one of the decisive factors in the ultimate destruction of Saxon resistance. The catastrophic year of 1015 forced Edmund to confront the brutal reality that conventional loyalty and established military tactics would not be sufficient to preserve his inheritance. The challenges he faced were not merely military but fundamentally political, because the Danish invasion had succeeded in exploiting the internal divisions that had already weakened Saxon resistance. The attempted mobilization of English forces in late 1015 revealed the extent to which the traditional military system had been corrupted. When Edmund succeeded in raising an army, possibly drawing on his wife's connections in the East Midlands, the force that assembled represented one of the last attempts to organize Saxon resistance along traditional lines. However, the broader coordination necessary for effective resistance to invasion had been severely compromised by years of internal division and erosion of trust. Edric's decision to abandon Saxon resistance and submit to Knut, along with 40 ships and their crews, represented the most dramatic of these betrayals, delivering a blow to English defensive capabilities that was both material and psychological. The ships alone represented a substantial portion of England's limited naval capacity, while the crews included experienced warriors whose knowledge of English defences would prove invaluable to Danish planning. More significantly, the defection demonstrated to other potential supporters that even the most powerful English nobles had concluded that Danish victory was inevitable, creating a bandwagon effect that accelerated the collapse of organized resistance. The death of King Ethelred on April 23, 1016, created a succession crisis that immediately exposed the full extent of English political fragmentation. While the citizens of London chose Edmund as king, the rest of the Witan meeting at Southampton elected Knut, creating a constitutional situation that guaranteed continued civil war and ensured that whatever resources remained for defense would be dissipated in internal conflicts. Edmund's response to this crisis demonstrated both his personal courage and strategic intelligence, but it also revealed the impossible situation he faced as a king whose authority was contested not only by foreign enemies with superior military resources, but by a significant portion of his own nobility. His decision to mount what contemporary sources describe as a last-ditch effort to revive England's defence required him to operate without institutional support, relying instead on personal relationships and temporary alliances that could dissolve at any moment. The military campaigns that Edmund conducted during the summer of 1016 represented some of the most impressive displays of individual leadership in the entire history of Saxon resistance. Time and again, Edmund succeeded in assembling effective fighting forces and winning tactical victories against Danish armies that had previously seemed invincible, proving that Saxon military potential had not been entirely destroyed. The battles fought at Penselwood in Somerset and Shurston in Wiltshire were inconclusive, not because of any failure of English courage, but because the broader strategic situation made decisive victory impossible for forces that could not maintain themselves in the field without access to secure bases and reliable supply arrangements. The relief of London represented perhaps Edmund's greatest tactical achievement, demonstrating that Saxon resistance could still be effective when properly organized. His defeat of Danish forces near Brentford showed that English armies could still win significant victories, though the heavy losses suffered illustrated the unsustainable cost of such victories. The repeated cycle of siege and relief at London perfectly illustrated both the potential and the limitations of Edmund's resistance. While the citizens proved capable of withstanding Danish assault when properly supported by royal forces, the need to constantly relieve the city prevented English armies from taking the offensive actions that might have driven the invaders from English soil altogether. The pursuit of Knut into Kent after the victory at Otford represented Edmund's closest approach to achieving the kind of strategic breakthrough that might have fundamentally altered the course of the Danish conquest. However, even this success was ultimately undermined by betrayal. At the very moment when Danish forces appeared vulnerable to decisive defeat, Edric approached Edmund at Aylesford with an offer of reconciliation that would prove to be the final and most devastating betrayal in a career built on treachery. The Battle of Asundun, fought on October 18, 1016, represented the culmination of Edric's campaign of betrayal. The location of this decisive battle in Essex was itself the result of careful manipulation by Edric, who had convinced Edmund that Knut's forces were withdrawing toward York for the winter, when in fact they were positioning themselves for a final confrontation. The battle itself initially proceeded according to Edmund's expectations, with English forces holding their own against Danish attacks, and perhaps even gaining the upper hand through superior individual courage and fighting ability. However, the apparent success of Saxon arms was itself part of the elaborate deception that had been planned by Edric and his Danish collaborators. The moment of betrayal came at the height of the battle, when English forces appeared to be gaining decisive advantage. At this crucial moment, Edric and his substantial Mercian contingent suddenly fled the field after what appears to have been a carefully timed signal. The psychological impact of this betrayal was devastating, because it demonstrated that even at the moment of potential triumph, Saxon forces could not trust their own commanders. The specific method that Edric employed involved the decapitation of an English soldier who bore some physical resemblance to King Edmund, and the public display of this severed head as supposed proof that the Saxon king had been killed in battle. This macabre theatre was designed to demoralize English forces and create confusion that would make organized resistance impossible. The success of this gruesome stratagem in breaking English resistance revealed how completely morale had become more important than purely military considerations. The collapse of Saxon resistance following this deception was swift and complete, with English forces abandoning their positions and fleeing in disorder. During the battle, Bishop Eadnoth, the younger of Dorchester, was killed by Knut's men while saying Mass for Edmund's troops, an act of particular brutality that demonstrated the breakdown of traditional military courtesies. The deaths of veteran Saxon commanders further illustrated the devastating losses suffered by English leadership at this crucial battle. The aftermath of Asundun forced Edmund to accept the humiliating Treaty of Alney, which divided England between him and Knut, while establishing terms that virtually guaranteed eventual Danish control of the entire kingdom. The treaty's provision that the survivor would inherit the other's territories created powerful incentives for the elimination of Edmund through assassination, rather than waiting for natural death to resolve the succession. The brief period between the Treaty of Alney and Edmund's death in late November represented perhaps the most dangerous time in his entire reign, because the arrangement was inherently unstable and created powerful incentives for various parties to eliminate him. The Danish king had every reason to want Edmund dead as quickly as possible, because his continued existence represented a potential rallying point for renewed Saxon resistance. More significantly, Edric and other English collaborators who had betrayed Saxon independence had their own compelling motives for ensuring that Edmund could never seek revenge for their betrayals. These men had committed themselves so completely to the Danish cause that their own survival depended on the permanent elimination of any Saxon leadership that might threaten their positions. The involvement of Edric in planning Edmund's assassination represented the final betrayal in a career built on treachery, but it also demonstrated the extent to which the corruption of Saxon political institutions had created a class of English nobles who were more committed to their own survival than to any larger political or cultural values. Edric's willingness to arrange the murder of his own brother-in-law showed that even the most basic bonds of family loyalty had been dissolved by prolonged crisis. The choice of assassination method was itself a reflection of the depraved mindset that had come to characterize Saxon politics during this period of institutional collapse. The decision to murder a king while he was relieving himself represented not just practical calculation, but deliberate humiliation, designed to destroy the dignity that surrounded royal authority and make future resistance to Danish rule seem both pointless and degrading. The recruitment of Edric's son as the actual assassin added another layer of depravity to the plot, because it involved the corruption of a young man who should have been learning traditional values of loyalty and service, but who was instead being initiated into the most fundamental betrayal of the bonds that held society together. The assassination of King Edmund Ironside on the night of November 30th, 1016, represented not merely the murder of an individual monarch, but the destruction of royal dignity through a method so degrading that it challenged every traditional concept of how political conflicts should be conducted. The location chosen for this ultimate betrayal was itself a deliberate insult, calculated to maximize the humiliation while ensuring the complete vulnerability of the victim. The wooden privy that served as the site of this royal assassination was typical of medieval sanitary arrangements, consisting of a simple wooden seat positioned over a deep pit. However, the very design of such structures also made them ideal locations for assassination, because the victim would be completely vulnerable while the assassin could approach from below through the cesspit without being detected by guards. According to Henry of Huntingdon, whose account provides the most detailed description of the assassination, the murder was carried out by the son of Ealdorman, Edric, who had concealed himself in the cesspit beneath the royal privy, where he waited for the king to arrive. The young assassin had been positioned in this location by his father's careful planning, demonstrating the premeditated nature of a plot designed to ensure both the death of the king and the complete destruction of his dignity in a single act of unprecedented depravity. The weapon employed was described as a sharp dagger that was thrust twice into the king's private parts with deliberate precision before being left embedded in his bowels as the assassin fled into the darkness. The decision to leave the weapon in the wound served multiple purposes, ensuring that Edmund's death would be as slow and painful as possible, while providing clear evidence of the degrading method by which England's last Saxon king had been eliminated. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was carefully orchestrated to maximize both the shock and the humiliation experienced by those who discovered the scene. The timing ensured that Edmund's death would be discovered quickly enough to prevent any attempt at medical intervention, but slowly enough to ensure that the perpetrators had sufficient time to establish alibis and begin implementing the political arrangements that would legitimize Danish succession. The reaction of Edmund's household to the discovery of his murdered body revealed the complete success of the psychological warfare that had been such an important component of the assassination plot. The shock and revulsion provoked by the circumstances of his death made it virtually impossible for anyone to treat him as a martyred hero whose memory might inspire continued resistance to Danish rule. The swift consolidation of Danish authority following Edmund's death demonstrated that Knut and his supporters had been carefully prepared to take advantage of the power vacuum created by the assassination. The speed with which English nobles accepted Danish sovereignty showed that Edmund's death had eliminated the last significant obstacle to foreign conquest, while providing a warning about the fate that awaited anyone who might consider challenging the new political order. The treatment of Edmund's surviving supporters revealed the nature of the purge that followed his assassination, as Knut moved quickly to eliminate anyone who might serve as a focal point for renewed Saxon resistance. The exile of Edmund's young sons, Edward and Edmund, demonstrated that even children were considered potential threats that had to be removed from England to prevent them from becoming symbols of Saxon legitimacy. According to chronicler John of Worcester, Knut sent Edmund's infant sons to King Olof Skirtkonung of Sweden with orders to have them murdered, but the Swedish king refused to comply. Instead, Olof secretly sent the two young princes to safety at the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, where they found sanctuary thousands of miles from their homeland and completely beyond the reach of Danish power. The fate of Edric himself in the aftermath of his successful betrayal provided a particularly instructive example of how political treachery ultimately consumes those who practice it. Knut's execution of Edric at the Christmas festivities of 1017 was itself a masterpiece of political theatre, demonstrating the new king's understanding of justice and his recognition that someone who had betrayed one master could easily betray another when circumstances made such betrayal advantageous. The irony of Edric being eliminated by the very regime he had helped to establish was not lost on contemporary observers, who saw in his death a form of poetic justice that validated traditional moral teachings about the self-destructive nature of treachery and the ultimate futility of placing personal advancement above loyalty and honor. The story of Edmund Ironside's assassination stands as a permanent reminder that political authority, however legitimately established and however heroically defended, remains vulnerable to the corrosive effects of betrayal when the bonds that hold society together are subjected to sufficient pressure. Most importantly, Edmund's story demonstrates that behind all the pageantry of political power lie human beings whose dignity and worth transcend their temporary roles in the great dramas of history, and whose suffering demands recognition regardless of the political purposes it may have served. The image of England's last Saxon king, murdered while relieving himself, will forever stand as a symbol of how completely political dignity can be destroyed when moral constraints are abandoned, and when the pursuit of power becomes disconnected from any larger sense of justice, honor, or human dignity that transcends immediate political calculations and personal advantage.